How deep do coral cities really extend? Complete script. Rörvasse, Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the ocean's most beautiful deceptions, and trust me, you definitely wouldn't survive this without some serious equipment, but that's what makes it so fascinating to explore from the safety of your bed. You're floating above what looks like a vibrant coral reef, the kind you've seen in documentaries with their rainbow fish and swaying sea fans. But what you're witnessing is actually just the penthouse level of something far more incredible. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how this little community spans the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're suspended in crystal clear water, about 30 feet below the surface, watching parrotfish lazily munch on coral like they're at an all-you-can-eat buffet. The reef spreads out beneath you in every direction, a living carpet of blues and greens and impossible oranges that seem to pulse with their own inner light. But here's what most people don't realize as they snorkel above these underwater gardens. This colorful display you're admiring represents less than 5% of the actual reef structure. Think of it like looking at the rooftop gardens of New York City and assuming that's all there is to Manhattan. You're seeing the surface amenities, the pretty parts designed to catch sunlight and impress visitors, while the real city extends downward into darkness for hundreds, sometimes thousands of feet. The coral polyps creating this shallow spectacle are just the latest generation in a construction project that's been ongoing for millions of years. You notice how the coral formations seem to follow certain patterns, creating valleys and ridges that channel water flow in specific directions. These aren't random growths. Researchers have discovered that coral reefs develop with an almost urban planning sensibility, creating neighborhoods optimized for different functions. The branching staghorn corals form apartment complexes for small fish, while the massive brain corals serve as anchor points for the entire community structure. As you drift closer to the reef's edge, you start to notice something strange. The colorful coral doesn't just stop at some arbitrary depth limit, it transitions. The bright yellows and pinks fade into deeper purples and burgundies, and then into colors that don't quite have names in our surface world vocabulary. It's like watching a sunset in reverse, except this sunset has been happening continuously for geological ages. Ancient Polynesian navigators told stories about coral cities that extended all the way to the ocean floor, places where the reef spirits built their palaces in the crushing darkness below. Modern marine biologists initially dismissed these tales as folklore, but recent deep-sea exploration has revealed that indigenous knowledge often contains remarkably accurate observations about oceanic phenomena that science is only beginning to understand. Researchers still argue about whether coral reefs should be classified as single organisms or complex ecosystems, but down here in the water with them, you start to understand that the distinction might not matter. What you're looking at functions like a living city, regardless of how we categorize it taxonomically. Every surface teems with activity, every crevice serves a purpose, and every level of the structure supports different communities with their own specialized roles. You watch a cleaner wrasser set up shop in a coral outcropping, and within minutes a line of larger fish forms, waiting patiently for their turn at the underwater spa. It's like a drive-through car wash, except the car wash has been operating in the same location for centuries, and the customers, include creatures that haven't changed their basic body plans since before dinosaurs walked the earth. The water temperature here stays remarkably constant, but you can feel subtle currents carrying different scents and particles. Some currents smell faintly of sulfur, others carry the metallic taste of deep ocean minerals. These chemical signatures are messages in a language older than human civilization, instructions and invitations flowing between the surface reef and the mysterious depths below. As afternoon light filters down through the water column, creating those cathedral rays that make everything look like a nature documentary, you begin to realize that what you're seeing is just the lobby of a skyscraper, the real reef, the ancient reef, the reef that would make surface coral gardens look like window boxes, waits somewhere in the darkness beneath your fins. Word count 1098. Section 2. You begin your descent, leaving behind the sun-dappled shallows and entering the reef's true architecture. The water grows cooler against your skin, that pleasant kind of cool that makes you want to sink deeper rather than surface for warmth. Here at 60 feet, the coral formations start to reveal their more secretive nature, growing in configurations that seem almost deliberately designed to create hidden spaces. The branching corals you observed from above now form intricate archways and tunnels, creating a three-dimensional maze that extends in every direction. You swim through what can only be described as a natural cathedral, complete with ribbed vaulting made from centuries of coral growth. The acoustics down here are remarkable. Every small sound from a fish brushing against coral or your own breathing apparatus creates soft echoes that seem to whisper through the water. Schools of fish move through these coral corridors, like commuters navigating subway tunnels, following routes that have been established over generations. You notice that different species seem to prefer different levels of the reef structure, creating a vertical neighborhood system that would make urban planners weep with envy. The angelfish stick to the upper galleries, where filtered sunlight still penetrates, while deeper dwelling species emerge from lower chambers that disappear into blue-black shadows. What strikes you most is how the coral growth patterns create rooms, not random cavities or accidental hollow spaces, but chambers with distinct architectural features. Some have multiple entrances, like underwater amphitheaters. Others form narrow corridors that open into circular gathering spaces. The coral polyps responsible for this construction have been building according to blueprints encoded in their DNA for millions of years, creating structures that serve functions we're only beginning to understand. You pause inside one of these coral chambers and realize the walls are alive with activity. Tiny organisms you hadn't noticed from a distance cover every surface, creating living wallpaper that filters water and processes nutrients. It's like being inside the digestive system of some benevolent giant, except this giant has been growing for centuries and shows no signs of stopping. Medieval European legends spoke of underwater palaces built by sea kings in the deepest parts of the ocean, places where mortal visitors would lose track of time and emerge years later to find their surface world completely changed. These stories often described architecture that grew rather than being constructed, buildings that breathed and pulsed with their own life force. Researchers still argue about whether coral formations develop randomly or follow specific environmental programming, but the evidence of intentional design becomes more obvious the deeper you go. The water flow patterns through these coral structures create a circulation system that brings fresh nutrients to every level, while carrying waste products away. It's municipal engineering on a scale that makes human cities look like temporary camping arrangements. You notice that the colors down here aren't the bright tropical hues from the surface, but they're no less beautiful. Deep purples and midnight blues dominate, punctuated by the occasional flash of bioluminescent green when something startled by your presence lights up briefly before disappearing into the reef's deeper recesses. These colors exist in a spectrum that cameras struggle to capture accurately. Hues that your eyes can perceive but your brain has trouble naming. The coral formations at this depth grow in patterns that remind you of Islamic geometric art or Frank Lloyd Wright's organic architecture. Nothing feels random or accidental. Each branching structure seems positioned to maximize water flow while creating the maximum number of habitable spaces. You're swimming through urban planning that makes human city design look like a child's scattered building blocks. As you move deeper through these coral galleries, you start to understand why early deep-sea explorers reported seeing cities beneath the waves. The reef structures create genuine neighborhoods with main thoroughfares, side streets, residential areas, and what can only be described as commercial districts where different species gather to trade services. Cleaner fish set up stations in coral alcoves, while larger predators patrol the reef's outer boundaries like underwater security guards. Remember those chemical signatures you noticed at the surface, the subtle scents and mineral tastes carried by different currents. Down here in the reef's architectural heart, you can trace these chemical messages to their sources. Some chambers serve as nutrient processing centers, breaking down organic matter and distributing the results throughout the reef system. Others function as nurseries, their coral walls specially designed to create gentle currents perfect for developing fish larvae. The engineering marvel of it all starts to overwhelm you as you realize that this coral city has been expanding and renovating itself continuously for thousands of years, adapting its layout to changing ocean conditions while maintaining the same basic urban infrastructure. You're swimming through a metropolis that makes Rome look like a recent subdivision. Word count 1073. Selassie, Section 3. You continue your descent past the 100-foot mark, and suddenly the reef transforms into something that defies every assumption about coral growth patterns. The sunlight from above now reaches you as nothing more than a dim blue glow, like the emergency lighting in a vast underground complex. Yet somehow the coral formations down here seem more elaborate, more architecturally ambitious than anything you witnessed in the shallows. The structures rising around you look like underwater skyscrapers, massive coral towers that disappear both above and below your current position into the oceanic gloom. Some of these formations stretch upward for what must be hundreds of feet, their surfaces riddled with openings and chambers that house creatures you've never seen before. It's like swimming through a district of high-rise apartment buildings, except these buildings have been growing for millennia, and their residents have evolved specifically to live in vertical neighborhoods. You swim closer to examine one of these coral towers and discover that each level supports completely different ecosystems. Near what you might call the penthouse floors, you find species that still depend on the filtered sunlight trickling down from above. But as you follow the structure downward, the inhabitants become increasingly alien. Creatures adapted to life in perpetual darkness, who navigate their coral apartments using senses that surface dwellers never developed. The coral itself has adapted to these lightless conditions in ways that challenge everything marine biologists thought they knew about reef development. Instead of the compact, energy-conserving growth patterns you'd expect in low-light environments, these deep coral formations spread out in elaborate decorative flourishes, creating ornate balconies and spiral staircases that serve no obvious survival function. It's as if the coral polyps down here have developed an aesthetic sense, building for beauty rather than mere efficiency. Ancient Chinese texts describe underwater mountains made of living stone, places where the sea dragons built their palaces in the deepest parts of the ocean. These accounts, often dismissed as mythology, described structures that grew taller than surface mountains but remained hidden beneath the waves. Modern sonar mapping has revealed coral formations in deep ocean trenches that match these ancient descriptions with startling accuracy. You notice movement in the coral towers around you, not the quick darting of surface fish, but slow, deliberate motion that suggests intelligence and purpose. Creatures emerge from the coral apartments like residents stepping onto their balconies, some bioluminescent displays creating brief light shows in the darkness. These aren't random flashes of startled sea life, but what appears to be communication between residents of different floors in the coral high-rises. Researchers still argue about whether deep coral formations can actually support the massive vertical ecosystems that recent discoveries suggest. But swimming through this underwater cityscape, you can see the evidence with your own eyes. Each level of these coral towers maintains its own microclimate, its own community of specialized residents, and its own role in the larger reef economy. The water pressure down here should theoretically limit coral growth. Yet these structures seem to thrive under conditions that would crush surface varieties. The coral polyps have developed reinforcement techniques that human engineers are only beginning to understand, creating internal support systems that allow their towers to reach impossible heights while maintaining structural integrity. You remember the cleaner fish stations from the shallow reef, those drive-through car wash operations that seemed so charmingly organized. Down here in the towers, similar service industries operate on multiple floors, creating vertical shopping districts where different species travel between levels to access specialized services. It's like an underwater mall, except this mall has been in continuous operation since before humans discovered agriculture. The acoustics in this deep reef district are completely different from the cathedral echoes you experienced in the mid-level chambers. Sound here travels in strange ways, bouncing off the coral towers and creating acoustic shadows, where conversations between marine residents remain private despite the open water environment. You suspect that these coral architects have been engineering sound privacy into their apartment buildings for centuries. As you navigate between these towering coral formations, following what appear to be established traffic patterns used by the local fish populations, you start to understand that depth isn't a limitation for reef development, it's simply a different neighborhood with different amenities. The coral towers around you represent urban planning, on a scale that makes surface cities look like temporary encampments. The bioluminescent displays as you're witnessing aren't random light shows, but a complex communication network that connects all levels of these vertical reef communities. Messages travel up and down the coral towers in patterns of light that create a kind of underwater internet, information flowing between floors and buildings in a language that predates human civilization by millions of years. Word count 1095. Zidaya, section 4. You follow what appears to be a main boulevard between the coral towers, and immediately notice that you've entered the reef's circulatory system. Invisible rivers of nutrient-rich water flow around and through the coral structures, creating highways of sustenance that feed every level of this underwater metropolis. These currents carry a complex mixture of microscopic life, dissolved minerals, and organic particles that function like a meal delivery service operating 24 hours a day. The water moving past your face tastes different here, richer and more complex than the surface waters you descended through earlier. You can detect hints of iron, calcium, and other minerals that the coral polyps extract from the sea water to build their limestone skyscrapers. But there's something else mixed in, a biological richness that suggests these currents have traveled through multiple reef neighborhoods, picking up nutrients and chemical messages from each district they've visited. You notice that different coral formations seem designed to channel these nutrient streams in specific directions. The tower structures you observed earlier aren't just apartment buildings. They're also part of a vast plumbing system that directs food-bearing currents throughout the reef complex. Some coral formations act like underwater traffic circles, gathering multiple nutrient streams and redistributing them to different reef districts according to demand. The engineering behind this biological infrastructure becomes more impressive the longer you observe it. Coral structures that initially appeared decorative reveal themselves as sophisticated flow management systems. Those spiral staircases and ornate balconies you admired aren't just architectural flourishes. They create specific turbulence patterns that help mix nutrients into the water column and ensure even distribution throughout the reef community. Following one of these nutrient highways, you discover feeding stations where different species gather to intercept the flowing bounty. It's like watching commuters grabbing coffee on their way to work, except these commuters have been perfecting the timing over evolutionary timescales. Fish arrive at specific locations just as the richest concentrations of plankton flow past, and they disappear back into the coral structures once they've had their fill. Viking sagas tell of underwater rivers that flowed through the deep ocean, carrying the spirits of fallen warriors to halls beneath the waves. These mythological descriptions often mentioned currents that flowed uphill and streams that carried both the living and the dead through underwater realms that existed parallel to the surface world. Modern oceanography has discovered deep water currents that do indeed flow against gravity, carrying nutrients upward through oceanic thermal columns. Researchers still argue about whether coral reefs actively engineer their water flow patterns or simply adapt to existing currents, but the evidence suggests these biological cities have been practicing hydraulic engineering for millions of years. The placement of coral structures creates pressure differentials that pull nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean and distribute it throughout the reef system with remarkable efficiency. You swim deeper along one of these nutrient superhighways and encounter something that looks like an underwater waterfall, except it's flowing upward. Dense mineral-rich water rises through a channel in the coral formation, creating a vertical river that carries deep-sea nutrients up to higher levels of the reef community. The coral structures around this upwelling have grown into configurations that maximize their exposure to the rising nutrient stream. The creatures living along these underwater rivers have developed feeding strategies that would impress any efficiency expert. Some species position themselves permanently at optimal flow points, becoming living filters that extract specific nutrients from the passing water. Others follow the nutrient streams like surfers riding waves, traveling through the reef system, by hopping from one current to another. Remember those bioluminescent communication networks you witnessed in the coral towers, the light-based internet connecting different levels of the reef community. Those same light signals serve another purpose in the nutrient distribution system, alerting different species when particularly rich concentrations of food are flowing through their neighborhoods. It's like a dinner bell system that operates throughout the entire reef complex. You realize that what you initially thought were separate coral formations are actually components of a single integrated system. The towers, the archways, the spiral structures, they're all part of a three-dimensional network designed to capture, process, and distribute the ocean's bounty. The reef isn't just a collection of individual coral colonies competing for resources, it's a cooperative venture in municipal engineering. The nutrient highways you're swimming through connect not just different areas of this particular reef, but different reef systems across vast distances. You can taste chemical signatures in the water that suggest these currents have traveled hundreds of miles, carrying messages and materials between coral cities scattered across the ocean floor. It's a supply chain network that makes human global commerce look primitive by comparison. As you follow these underwater rivers deeper into the reef system, you start to understand that the ocean's food web isn't just about who eats whom. It's about infrastructure, logistics, and urban planning on a scale that surface dwellers never imagined possible. Word count 1, so 81. Section 5. You descend through what feels like geological time itself, following the nutrient currents deeper until they lead you to the reef's archaeological district. Here, beneath the living coral metropolis, lie the fossilized remains of previous reef civilizations, layer upon layer of ancient coral cities that have been built over, abandoned, and built over again across millions of years of oceanic history. The transition from living reef to fossil reef happens gradually, like walking from a bustling downtown into a historical preservation district. The vibrant purples and midnight blues of the deep living coral give way to the pale limestone whites and grays of coral skeletons that died centuries ago. But these aren't random boneyards of extinct sea life. They're the preserved urban infrastructure of previous reef eras, complete with streets, neighborhoods, and public spaces that once teemed with now extinct species. You swim through coral formations that haven't housed living polyps for thousands of years, yet their architectural legacy continues to influence how the modern reef develops above them. The ancient coral city planners created foundations so solid and layouts so efficient that contemporary coral growth follows the same basic street grid, building new neighborhoods on top of old ones like any expanding metropolitan area. The fossilized coral structures reveal construction techniques that modern reefs still use today. You can see where ancient coral engineers reinforced weak points in their towers with extra calcium carbonate deposits, creating structural supports that have lasted for geological ages. Some of these reinforcement strategies are so sophisticated that human architects are studying them for insights into earthquake-resistant building design. Swimming through these ancient coral ruins, you encounter the preserved remains of species that haven't existed for millions of years. Fossilized shells and skeletal structures embedded in the old coral walls tell stories of ecosystems that once thrived in ocean conditions completely different from today's. Some of these extinct residents were giants compared to their modern descendants, suggesting that ancient reef cities supported much larger populations than current coral communities. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe underwater cities built by the ancestor spirits in the time before time, places where the first coral learned to build homes for the first fish. These creation myths often mention layers of ancient cities stacked beneath the living reefs, with each layer representing a different epoch in the ocean's history. Geological surveys of major reef systems consistently find exactly these kinds of stratified coral formations. Researchers still argue about whether ancient coral reefs were more structurally advanced than modern ones, but the fossil evidence suggests that some extinct coral species possessed construction abilities that current reef builders have lost. You swim past fossilized coral formations that created more complex internal spaces and more elaborate external architectures than anything in the living reef above. The water moving through these ancient coral graveyards carries different chemical signatures than the nutrient streams in the living reef. Here, the currents taste of deep time, carrying dissolved minerals from coral that grew when the continents were arranged differently, and the ocean's chemistry followed completely different rules. It's like tasting water that has been filtered through millions of years of geological memory. You notice that the ancient coral formations created different acoustic environments than their modern descendants. The fossilized structures channel sound in ways that create haunting underwater symphonies, as if the ghost cities are still echoing with the conversations of their long-dead residents. Some of these acoustic effects are so pronounced that marine biologists use them to map the internal architecture of buried coral formations. The fossil layers reveal that coral reef construction has followed boom and bust cycles throughout oceanic history. Some ancient layers show evidence of rapid expansion and elaborate architectural experimentation, while others suggest periods of conservative construction focused on survival rather than innovation. You're swimming through the urban history of an ancient civilization that has been continuously rebuilding itself since before complex life existed on land. Remember those upward-flowing nutrient rivers you discovered in the living reef, the underwater waterfalls that carry deep-sea minerals to higher reef levels. The fossilized coral formations show that these same hydraulic engineering principles have been operating for millions of years, with ancient coral architects positioning their cities to take advantage of nutrient upwellings that have remained geologically stable across vast spans of time. The stratified nature of these ancient reef cities creates a three-dimensional timeline that extends both upward toward the living reef and downward into increasingly ancient geological periods. You're swimming through an urban core that has been continuously occupied longer than any surface city, a metropolis that has survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and massive changes in global climate while maintaining the same basic commitment to cooperative marine architecture. As you explore deeper into these coral catacombs, you realize that the living reef above represents just the latest chapter in a construction project that spans geological epochs, a building program so ambitious and long-term that it makes human urban planning look like temporary camping. Word count 1078. Plajat Section 6. You swim through the intersection between the fossil graveyards and the living reef and discover you've entered the night shift district. Here, in the transition zone where ancient coral bones meet modern coral flesh, operates the reef's most industrious and mysterious workforce, the deep cleaning crews that maintain this massive underwater metropolis around the clock. These aren't the colorful cleaner fish you observed in the shallow reef. Those cheerful spa operators running their drive-through car wash services for visiting clientele. Down here in the reef's utility corridors, you encounter creatures so specialized and so perfectly adapted to their maintenance roles that they seem more like living tools than independent organisms. Some of these janitors have never seen sunlight, spending their entire lives in the service tunnels and maintenance shafts that keep the reef city functioning. You watch a team of sea cucumbers methodically processing organic waste through one of the ancient coral chambers, their bodies working like biological vacuum cleaners to extract debris and excess nutrients from the water column. They move in coordinated patterns that suggest they're following predetermined routes through the reef infrastructure, like street sweepers following established schedules through different neighborhoods on different nights. The efficiency of these deep cleaning operations becomes more impressive the longer you observe them. Different species handle different types of maintenance work, creating a specialized labor force that would make any municipal sanitation department envious. Some creatures focus exclusively on removing dead coral tissue, others specialize in clearing blocked nutrient channels, and still others seem dedicated to polishing the limestone surfaces of the ancient coral formations. What strikes you most is how these maintenance crews operate in shifts. As some species retreat into the deeper coral recesses, others emerge to take over their duties. You're witnessing a 24-hour maintenance schedule that has been operating continuously for millions of years, keeping the reef city clean and functional through ice ages, mass extinctions, and dramatic changes in ocean chemistry. Pacific Islander legends speak of sea spirits that emerge from the deep coral to tend the reef gardens during the darkest hours of the night. These guardian spirits were said to repair damage, remove disease, and prepare the reef for another day of bustling marine activity. Modern marine biology has discovered that these mythological night workers have very real counterparts in the specialized deep reef maintenance fauna. Researchers still argue about whether these cleaning crews operate according to instinctual programming or demonstrate genuine cooperative intelligence, but watching them work suggests levels of organization and task specialization that rival human urban management systems. Different maintenance teams seem to communicate with each other through chemical signals, coordinating their efforts to avoid duplicating work or leaving areas uncleaned. You notice that some of the maintenance workers double as security forces, patrolling the reef's deeper levels and removing potential threats before they can damage the coral infrastructure. These biological security guards have evolved weapons systems and defensive capabilities that make them formidable protectors of their underwater city. Some species patrol individually, while others work in coordinated groups that can respond to threats with military precision. The cleaning crews also serve as the reef's medical system, identifying and treating coral diseases before they can spread through the larger community. You watch specialized fish that function like underwater doctors, using their precise dental equipment to remove infected coral tissue and their chemical secretions to sterilize wounds in the coral formations. It's like a mobile hospital service that makes house calls throughout the reef city. Remember those nutrient highways you followed through the reef's circulatory system, those underwater rivers that carry food and minerals throughout the coral metropolis. The cleaning crews maintain these crucial transportation arteries, removing blockages and ensuring optimal flow patterns. Without their constant maintenance work, the reef's distribution system would quickly break down and the entire city would starve. You swim deeper into the maintenance tunnels and discover waste processing facilities where the reef's organic garbage gets converted into useful building materials. These biological recycling centers operate with near-perfect efficiency, turning dead fish, broken coral fragments, and organic waste into the raw materials that coral polyps use for new construction projects. Nothing gets wasted in this underwater economy. The coordination between different maintenance teams reveals a level of urban planning that extends far beyond the coral architects themselves. The cleaning crews, security forces, medical teams, and waste management specialists all operate according to schedules and protocols that ensure the reef city continues functioning smoothly, despite housing millions of residents in a relatively small three-dimensional space. As you observe these dedicated workers going about their essential but largely invisible duties, you start to understand that every thriving city, whether on land or underwater, depends on armies of specialized workers who keep the infrastructure running, while most residents sleep peacefully in their homes. Word count 1089. Sirisha, Section 7. You venture deeper into the reef's most enigmatic district and discover that you've entered the neural network zone, where the ancient coral formations and their living descendants communicate through electrical signals that predate the evolution of brains by hundreds of millions of years. The water around you tingles with subtle bioelectric activity, creating sensations that your human nervous system struggles to interpret but somehow recognizes as communication. The coral structures here look different from the architectural marvels you've been exploring, more organic and flowing, with surfaces that seem to pulse rhythmically in patterns that remind you of brain tissue or nerve fibers. These aren't random biological rhythms, but coordinated electrical waves that travel through the coral formations, like thoughts moving through a vast underwater mind that spans the entire reef system. You notice that the electrical activity intensifies around certain coral formations, creating nodes that function like synapses in this biological internet. These neural hubs receive electrical signals from multiple reef districts, process the information somehow, and then broadcast response signals throughout the network. It's like watching a conversation conducted entirely in bioelectric pulses, a dialogue between different sections of the reef city that has been ongoing for geological ages. The creatures living in this neural district have adapted to the constant electrical activity in fascinating ways. Some fish species seem to tap into the coral communication network, using the electrical signals for navigation and information gathering. Others generate their own bioelectric responses, participating in the reef-wide conversation through methods that marine biologists are only beginning to understand. You swim closer to one of the major neural nodes and feel the electrical activity increase dramatically, creating a tingling sensation across your skin that suggests you're witnessing communication events of significant importance. The coral formations around this neural hub pulse in synchronized patterns that travel outward through branching coral channels, carrying messages to distant parts of the reef network at speeds that rival human telecommunications. Medieval European alchemists wrote about underwater kingdoms, where the sea itself possessed consciousness, places where the ocean floor could think and dream and communicate with those brave enough to venture into the deepest waters. These mystical accounts described electrical phenomena in the deep sea that modern science has only recently confirmed through sophisticated underwater monitoring equipment. Researchers still argue about whether coral reefs demonstrate genuine collective intelligence or simply exhibit complex, automated responses to environmental changes. but the evidence you're observing suggests that the reef operates as a single distributed consciousness, processing information and making decisions that affect the entire underwater metropolis. The electrical network extends beyond just the coral formations, incorporating the cleaning crews you observed earlier, the nutrient distribution systems, and even the ancient fossil layers. Every component of the reef city participates in this bioelectric internet, creating an information processing system that integrates millions of years of accumulated knowledge with real-time environmental data. You realize that the maintenance schedules, the architectural planning, the resource distribution, all the urban management systems you've been admiring throughout your descent operate under the coordination of this electrical network. The reef doesn't just grow randomly and hope for the best. It plans, communicates, and coordinates its development through bioelectric signals that carry information faster than chemical messages could travel through the water. Remember those bioluminescent light shows you witnessed in the coral towers, those beautiful displays that seemed like communication between residents of different floors. Those light signals represent just the visible spectrum of a much more complex communication system that operates primarily through electrical impulses invisible to human observation, but detectable through the subtle sensations you're experiencing. The electrical activity follows daily and seasonal rhythms that suggest the reef consciousness operates on multiple timescales simultaneously. Some signals pulse rapidly, handling immediate coordination tasks, like directing the cleaning crews or adjusting nutrient flow patterns. Other electrical patterns operate much more slowly, carrying information about long-term planning, climate adaptation, and architectural development that spans decades or centuries. You notice that your presence in the neural network zone generates its own electrical responses from the coral formations, as if the reef consciousness is aware of your visit and curious about this strange surface creature exploring its communication infrastructure. The electrical patterns around you shift and adapt, creating new signal pathways that seem designed to accommodate your foreign presence in the reef's information processing system. Swimming through this underwater internet, you start to understand that individual coral polyps aren't the reef's basic building blocks. They're more like neurons in a vast biological computer that processes environmental information and coordinates responses across spatial scales that dwarf human cities and temporal scales that span geological epochs. The reef has been thinking, learning, and communicating since before complex life existed on land, developing solutions to urban planning problems that human cities are only beginning to face. Word count 1097, Richard, Section 8. You follow the electrical signals deeper into the reef network and discover that you've entered the reef's transportation hub, where massive underwater corridors serve as superhighways for marine life traveling between distant ocean basins. These aren't the local nutrient streams you explored earlier, but intercontinental migration routes that connect coral cities across thousands of miles of open ocean, creating a global network of underwater travel infrastructure. The coral formations here have grown into configurations that optimize water flow for long-distance travel, creating current amplifiers and direction channels that help migrating species conserve energy during their oceanic journeys. You swim through what can only be described as underwater train stations, complete with waiting areas where different species gather before joining the major migration currents that will carry them to distant feeding grounds or breeding areas. The scale of this transportation network becomes apparent as you observe the traffic patterns flowing through these deep reef corridors. Species you recognize from nature documentaries about distant oceans pass by you like commuters hurrying through subway tunnels, following migration routes that have remained stable for millions of years. Some of these travelers are heading to Arctic feeding grounds, others toward equatorial breeding areas, all of them using the reef's highway system to navigate across oceanic distances that would be impossible to cross through open water swimming alone. You notice that different migration corridors handle different types of traffic, creating a sophisticated routing system that prevents overcrowding and ensures optimal travel conditions for various species. Fast-swimming predators use express routes with minimal obstructions, while slower-moving filter feeders follow scenic routes through nutrient-rich areas where they can feed during their journeys. The coral architects have engineered these migration superhighways with remarkable precision, creating acceleration zones where ocean currents gain speed and deceleration areas where tired travelers can rest and refuel. Some corridors include what appear to be service stations, specialized coral formations that house cleaning crews and provide protected areas where migrating species can recover from parasites or injuries sustained during their long journeys. Polynesian navigation legends describe underwater pathways used by the great sea creatures to travel between distant islands, routes that remained invisible to surface vessels, but carried the ocean's largest inhabitants across vast distances with supernatural efficiency. Modern satellite tracking of marine megafauna has revealed migration patterns that match these traditional navigation stories with startling accuracy. Researchers still argue about how migrating species navigate these deep reef highways with such precision, but the electrical communication network you discovered earlier appears to provide GPS-like guidance services for traveling marine life. The bioelectric signals carry information about current conditions, weather patterns, and optimal travel timing that helps migrants make navigation decisions throughout their journeys. You swim alongside a group of rays gliding through one of the major migration corridors and realize that they're following electrical guidance signals broadcast by the coral network, receiving real-time updates about conditions along their intended route. It's like having a traffic control system that can communicate directly with individual vehicles, providing personalized routing advice based on current road conditions and destination requirements. The migration superhighways also serve as information networks, carrying news and genetic material between distant coral cities. Species traveling these routes act as messengers, carrying chemical signals and biological samples that help isolated reef communities stay connected to global oceanic conditions. Some migrations appear to exist primarily for communication purposes, with certain species making long journeys simply to deliver important information between reef networks. Remember those ancient fossil layers you explored earlier, the stratified remains of previous reef civilizations that have been building over each other for millions of years. The migration corridors show similar geological continuity, with current routes following the same basic pathways used by extinct species during previous oceanic eras. The reef highway system has maintained consistent traffic patterns despite massive changes in global climate and sea level. You discover junction points where multiple migration roads converge, creating underwater intersections that handle traffic from several different oceanic regions simultaneously. These coral traffic circles operate with timing systems that prevent collisions between different migration streams, using electrical signals to coordinate the flow of marine life through complex routing decisions. The energy efficiency of this transportation network impresses you as much as its organizational complexity. Migrating species using the reef highways can complete oceanic journeys using a fraction of the energy required for open water travel, conserving their strength for breeding, feeding, and other essential activities at their destinations. Swimming through these migration superhighways, you start to understand that the ocean isn't just a vast empty space that marine life must struggle to cross, but a carefully engineered transportation network that has been under continuous construction and improvement for millions of years, connecting underwater cities in a global infrastructure project that makes human transportation systems look primitive. You descend through the migration superhighways until the water around you begins to warm noticeably, and you realize you've reached the reef's power plant district, where underwater volcanic activity provides the energy that drives this entire coral metropolis. The coral formations here grow in patterns that seem designed to harness geothermal energy from hydrothermal vents and underwater volcanic systems, creating a power grid that has been operating reliably for millions of years. The first hydrothermal vent you encounter rises from the ocean floor like an underwater geyser, shooting superheated water, rich in minerals and chemicals, into the surrounding coral structures. The coral formations around these vents have evolved heat-resistant properties that allow them to grow closer to the thermal sources than should be biologically possible, creating living heat exchangers that capture and distribute geothermal energy throughout the reef network. You swim through coral formations that have grown into sophisticated heat management systems, channeling the scalding vent water through cooling chambers and distribution networks that deliver warm water to distant reef districts while preventing thermal damage to temperature-sensitive coral species. It's like swimming through the boiler room of a power plant, except this power plant grows and repairs itself while converting raw geothermal energy into the warmth and chemical nutrients that fuel the entire reef city. The creatures living in this volcanic district represent some of the most extreme adaptations you've encountered during your reef exploration. Some species thrive in water temperatures that would kill most marine life, while others have developed symbiotic relationships with chemosynthetic bacteria that convert the volcanic chemicals into usable energy without requiring any sunlight. These thermal zone specialists work like living industrial equipment, processing the raw output of underwater volcanic activity into forms that the broader reef community can utilize. You notice that the hydrothermal vents operate on cycles that seem coordinated with the reef's electrical communication network. The volcanic activity intensifies and diminishes according to patterns that suggest the reef somehow influences or responds to the geothermal systems, creating a feedback loop between biological and geological processes that optimizes energy production for the entire coral city. Norse mythology described underwater forges where the gods crafted magical artifacts using the heat from volcanic mountains beneath the sea. These mythical workshops were said to be tended by creatures that could survive in boiling water, beings that shaped both metal and living coral using the same volcanic fires. Modern deep-sea exploration has discovered hydrothermal vent ecosystems that match these ancient descriptions remarkably closely. Researchers still argue about whether coral reefs can actually influence underground volcanic activity or simply adapt to existing geothermal patterns, but the evidence suggests a level of integration between biological and geological systems that challenges traditional boundaries between living and non-living natural processes. The reef appears to participate actively in managing its own power supply. The mineral-rich water flowing from the hydrothermal vents carries raw materials that the coral architects use for construction projects throughout the reef network. These volcanic minerals provide the calcium, magnesium, and trace elements that coral polyps require for building their limestone skyscrapers. The reef's construction industry operates like a mining and manufacturing complex that extracts building materials directly from the Earth's interior. You swim through coral formations that function as mineral processing plants, extracting specific elements from the volcanic water and concentrating them for use in different construction projects. Some coral species specialize in calcium extraction for structural applications, while others focus on trace minerals needed for specialized biological functions. The division of labor rivals any human industrial operation. Remember those migration superhighways you explored earlier, those intercontinental transportation routes that connect distant reef networks across thousands of miles of ocean. The geothermal energy systems provide the power that drives the ocean currents used by those migration corridors, creating a renewable energy infrastructure that has been sustaining global marine transportation for geological ages. The heat from the volcanic systems also drives the nutrient circulation patterns that feed the entire reef community, creating convection currents that bring deep-sea minerals and organic matter up to the coral city's various districts. The reef has positioned itself to take maximum advantage of this geothermal circulation system, using volcanic energy to power both its construction industry and its food distribution network. You discover that different hydrothermal vents specialize in different types of energy production, some focusing on heat generation for temperature regulation, others emphasizing chemical production for industrial processes. The reef has developed a diversified energy portfolio that provides redundancy and reliability for its power supply, ensuring that the coral city can continue operating even if individual volcanic systems become inactive. Swimming through this underwater industrial district, you start to understand that the reef doesn't just depend on solar energy filtering down from the surface, but has developed direct access to the Earth's interior energy systems, tapping into power sources that will remain active long after the sun burns out. You rise slowly from the volcanic power districts, following the warm currents back toward the surface, and find yourself in the reef's research and development department, where cutting-edge coral formations are experimenting with architectural innovations that won't be widely adopted by the reef community for centuries to come. Here, in the experimental zones between the deep volcanic systems and the established coral neighborhoods, the reef tests new construction techniques and explores architectural possibilities that push the boundaries of what coral cities can become. The coral formations in this district look unlike anything you've encountered during your descent through the reef's established neighborhoods. Some structures grow in impossible spirals that seem to defy the basic laws of coral construction, while others experiment with hollow chambers and negative space in ways that create entirely new types of marine habitats. These aren't random mutations or construction errors, but deliberate experiments in coral architecture that suggest the reef possesses a research and development program more sophisticated than most human institutions. You swim through prototype coral buildings that incorporate multiple species in single structures, creating hybrid constructions that combine the best features of different coral types. These experimental towers demonstrate construction techniques that might eventually allow coral cities to grow in deeper, colder, or more chemically challenging ocean environments, expanding the reef's potential habitat range into areas currently considered impossible for coral development. The electrical communication network you discovered earlier operates at its most complex levels, here in the experimental districts, carrying vast amounts of data about construction successes and failures between different research sites. The reef appears to be conducting systematic experiments, testing architectural innovations across multiple locations simultaneously, and sharing the results through its bioelectric internet to accelerate the development of new construction technologies. You notice that some of the experimental coral formations incorporate materials and techniques borrowed from the ancient fossil layers, suggesting that the reef's research program includes archaeological studies of successful construction methods used by extinct coral civilizations. The reef learns from its own history, reviving architectural techniques that worked well under previous oceanic conditions and adapting them for contemporary challenges. The creatures living in these experimental districts represent the cutting edge of marine evolution, species that have adapted to habitat, types that don't exist anywhere else in the ocean. Some of these prototype residents might represent the future of marine life, organisms that have evolved to take advantage of architectural innovations that the reef is still perfecting through its research and development program. Japanese folklore tells of underwater palaces, where the sea kings conducted experiments in creating new forms of marine life, places where the boundaries between the possible and impossible became fluid and new realities could be tested before being released into the wider ocean. Modern marine biology has discovered deep reef zones, where species diversity and architectural complexity exceed anything found in established coral ecosystems. Researchers still argue about whether coral reefs can actually conduct organized research and development or simply respond to environmental pressures through random evolutionary processes, but the systematic nature of these experimental districts suggests purposeful investigation rather than accidental innovation. The reef appears to be actively exploring its own potential for future development. You swim through testing areas where different coral species collaborate on construction projects that neither could complete independently, creating partnership arrangements that might represent the future of reef architecture. These collaborative experiments demonstrate levels of interspecies cooperation that suggest the reef community is actively working to solve construction challenges that individual coral types cannot address alone. Remember those cleaning crews you observed in the reef's maintenance districts, those specialized workers that keep the coral city functioning around the clock. Here in the experimental zones, you encounter prototype cleaning species that are being developed to handle maintenance challenges that don't yet exist in the established reef neighborhoods, preparing for future urban development scenarios. The experimental districts also serve as training grounds for the reef's electrical communication network, testing new signal protocols and information processing techniques that might eventually be deployed throughout the entire coral city. Some of the bioelectric experiments you're witnessing represent communication technologies that won't reach widespread adoption for decades or centuries. You discover that the reef's research and development program operates on multiple timescales simultaneously, conducting short-term experiments that produce results within seasons or years, while also running long-term projects that won't reach completion for geological ages. The reef thinks and plans across temporal spans that make human long-term planning look impulsively short-sighted, As you explore these prototype coral neighborhoods, where the reef tests its most ambitious architectural visions, you realize that this underwater metropolis isn't just maintaining itself or adapting to current conditions, but actively designing its own evolutionary future, conducting research that will determine what coral cities might become millions of years from now. Swimming through these experimental districts, where the reef explores the boundaries of what's possible, you understand that this ancient coral civilization remains as innovative and forward-thinking today as it was when it first began building underwater cities before complex life existed on land. You begin your gentle ascent toward the surface, carrying with you the memory of architectural marvels that extend far deeper than any satellite can detect, coral cities that dwarf surface metropolises in their scope and sophistication. The reef's secrets slip away gradually as you rise through the water column, but the knowledge remains that beneath every coral garden, visible from above, lies an underwater civilization of staggering complexity and beauty. The sunlight grows stronger as you approach the surface, illuminating the familiar shallow coral gardens that first welcomed you to this underwater world. But now you understand that these colorful surface displays represent merely the decorative rooftops of skyscraper cities, the welcoming lobbies of architectural achievements that stretch down through darkness into the Earth's volcanic heart. The reef has revealed its true nature as a living metropolis that has been growing, thinking, and innovating for millions of years. The warm tropical waters embrace you as you float among the gentle surface currents, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of small waves and distant seabirds. The reef continues its ancient work beneath you, its cleaning crews maintaining the infrastructure, its communication and networks, processing information, its experimental districts, testing tomorrow's architectural innovations. The coral city operates with the quiet efficiency of all great civilizations, conducting its business while the surface world remains largely unaware of the sophisticated urban planning happening in the depths below. Your breathing slows as you drift in the shallow water, feeling the reef's electrical signals as subtle tingles against your skin, hearing its acoustic communications as gentle harmonies in the water around you. The coral metropolis extends its hospitality even to surface visitors, including you temporarily in its ancient community of marine residents who have called these underwater neighborhoods home for countless generations. Sleep comes easily here in the reef's embrace, surrounded by the knowledge that this coral civilization will continue its patient work of building underwater cities long after surface civilizations have risen and fallen, maintaining its commitment to cooperative marine architecture until the oceans themselves finally evaporate under an aging sun billions of years in the future. End of script. Sweet dreams.